Hello everyone, welcome to our event Build Your First App from Scratch. اليوم غادي نكملوا في التوكس ديالنا وغادي يكون معنا مستر أحمد القسيس والسابجكت ديال هاد التوك غيكون how to make your app secure. الوغ سي أحمد راه مكاينش اللي ما كيعرفوش في هاد الدومين هذا ديال security وحتى في لي كومبيتيتيف بروغرامين راه معروف زعما غني على التعريف و سي بون نباسي لك لا بارول سي احمد. عفاك راه المايك ديالك اكتيف المايك.
اوكي كنت كنهضر نسيت المايك. غادي نشير السكرين ديالي فين screen. I don't know which screen are you seeing, but
قبل ما يبدا سي احمد راه في المهم في الفري في الشات باش تحطوا لي كيسيون ديالكم اللي غادي يجاوب عليهم هو في الاخر.
yeah. So ان شاء الله. Let me just change it came two screens and one of them does not work. I don't know. Okay, let's share the screen again. It should work now. كتشوفوا السكرين ديالي ياك؟
وي
وي
اوكي دابا نورمالمون خاصكم تشوفوا التايتل ديال السلايد رايت.
وي كنشوفو.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm happy to be among you in this presentation or workshop or whatever we want to call it. I am Ahmed Lekssays. I'm a PhD student in cybersecurity in Italy, and I'm glad to be again among you. And thanks for the invitation. So before I start, I want to do a disclaimer that I am not responsible of any misuse of the information provided in this presentation. Some things might lead to some discovery of some private information that we should not have access to, but due to security issues we can have access to. So I am not responsible for any misuse of such information. For the title is how to secure your app, but you know that this subject is really vague. Like how to secure your application is a lot. Like we cannot do it in 30 minutes, we cannot do it even in 1 month or even 1 year. There are a lot of topics that we need to cover. There are a lot of techniques that we need to see, but in this presentation I want just to give you introductions to different things that might lead to critical security issues in your application. And I focused mainly on the deployment phase, because for the development phase I explain just a little bit, because it's not language agnostic. So for each language it has its own vulnerabilities, its own, not vulnerabilities, but its own security issues. So first, like, we'll start by GitHub, and I assume everyone here knows GitHub. It's a platform where you share your source code. So the first thing is to know is that when you share your code, everything is public. If you share it open source as an open repository, everything is public. So, and even sometimes when you deploy it in a private like server, you want always to defend your secrets as much as possible. So the first thing, when you know that it's public, the first thing that you should do is do not hard code secrets. Okay, so never use some private key as a hard coded variable. Never use some password as a hard-coded variable, never use some API key as a hard-coded variable. So to mitigate this, we use environment variables. These environment variables, it's something that's stored like at the level of your it's a variable, a shell variable. It's stored at the level of your shell, and when you do, like, for instance, export this variable, it's stored in your environment, and it cannot be accessed like directly, like any programming language has its own libraries to read these environment variables. And one of the examples that I'm putting in the slides is Python, by using OS on veron.get. And there is also another one, like another library for an environment. It's called env, and you do get env, for instance, and then the name, you pass it the name to the variable that you stored in your shell. Where you can store this, you can store them in plain text, but be careful, okay? Especially when you deploy them, you need always to check your .gitignore file. You should not, for instance, have the .env file in your repository. It should always be in the gitignore, because .env file, it's where, like, for instance, you export these variables and you like show them as a plain text. So for this, always always check before deploying anything or before sharing your code, check that the .env variable is not public. The same thing I would say about any file that may contain sensitive data. For instance, if we are deploying a WordPress website, we can talk about WP config. The configuration should always be only in your machine. It should not be public. The other thing here is the Git history. You might say that, okay, I deployed this in the past, but the repository now it's updated and there is no code there. But remember that there are always commits. Like, your history shows everything that you have done in the past. So anyone can, by a simple search, can check your history and find this sensitive information. I started by this problem because I see it a lot. Like sometimes even like in HackerOne, you find this kind of issues. Not HackerOne, the website, but some applications that are stored, that are enrolled in the bounty program of HackerOne, for instance. They are enrolled there, and you find some problems like this. Misconfiguration, they are called most of the time, but they are really critical, because you get a secret without any struggle. You get it plain text and that's it, which is really bad. The same thing here. I would talk about people who are storing password, username and password for the databases. It's the same problem. So you need to be very careful when you are deploying your code to be open source. Very careful. Like, even to avoid this, you need to deal with your local machine as a deployment. Okay, everything should be as environment variable. .gitignore should have only the allowed extensions and the allowed files, etc. If you keep this this system and you work with this philosophy in your local machine, it should be fine when you are deploying things online. The thing here that might surprise you, for people who don't know, is that in GitHub you can search for repositories, of course, but you can also search for file names. You can search for specific keywords, etc. Another thing would be downloading GitHub repositories locally. I know it's huge, but there are some solutions like Google BigQuery. They have the GitHub data set as a default data set that you can use, and you can run queries like there are SQL-like queries with Google BigQuery, and for this you can use regular expressions to look, for instance, for specific keys like crypto currency key, like private addresses, cryptocurrency, like public, even public addresses, to see if there is any match. They have like specific formats, and you can use regex expressions to query for that. You can just use, and now anyone can try it, in just open GitHub and write in the search file name column config.php, and you will see many things, like many surprising things, including like API keys, etc., of some sensitive services. And the surprising thing is that you can find even working API keys that you can exploit. I don't, of course, encourage that, but this is just to show you that people are still making these mistakes, and you need to avoid them when you want to deploy your solution online. The second thing here, we will move to Android applications. For Android applications, there is one rule: is you should never trust your APK file, never, because at the end, APK files can be reverse engineered, like, and get the Java source code or whatever language it was implemented with. Like, you can, a simple thing that you can do, just take an APK file, change its extension to zip, and then unzip it. You will see a classes.txt file, and download one tool called text2jar, and it will convert your code to Java. You can use some advanced tools like mob ESF or APK tools, etc., to see the source code. So this is just to show you that you should never store any secret in your source code. For this, there is a known issue, I think 1 month or 2 months ago. One problem regarding the COVID pass, like some developer of one country had the private key hard-coded in the APK file, and then this allowed anyone to generate signed fake pass. So if you check it with the verification, it's working, but at the end, it's not legitimate. It's fake. So again, never store your secrets in code. There is another thing related to the deployment, and I will talk here about the deployment in Amazon AWS, but this applies also to other platforms like Azure, etc. And you should know that securely deploying your solution is the same as securely implementing it. If you are implementing in doing a secure code and then you deploy it in a bad way, you multiplied your efforts by 0. And one of the things that you need to do is always to check permissions on your buckets or your droplets or whatever, in whatever platform you are using. You need to see who has access to. You need always to check if your buckets are private or not. And again, there are search engines for open buckets and for Azure both for Azure instances. You can check the website I'm referring to here, buckets of the Grey Hat Warfare, and you can see that you can search even files inside of buckets. You can use, there are a lot of tools like to check if a bucket is open or not, like a lot. You can just by a simple HTTP GET request, you can see if it's open or not. Again, we are talking about deployment, so I need to remind you to be careful with the Docker files and Docker Compose files, because they are related to the same thing I talked in the beginning. Sometimes you can like hard code environment variables and Docker files. You can hard code them in Docker Compose to be used by your containers, and this is always dangerous to do. So when I'm talking about never hard code anything in the code, so never use it unless it's an environment variable. I know this might be very hard, but at least when deploying it in an open environment, be careful about such things. For this buffer overflows, it's one of the most known vulnerabilities when you are coding a software. I know I didn't focus a lot about it here, but like it's if we need an analysis for it, we need a special course for it. For this, it's just an introduction. Of course, I will answer any questions that you might have, but if you see the code in the right, it's a C code. It uses like a buffer of 15, like size 15, and it uses the gets function. The gets function it doesn't check for the bound, so it's unsafe function to use. And sometimes, like in the best case, what could happen is that if you enter a password that is larger than the buffer, it will just crash, and like the compiler would do that. And it's the best case, but sometimes you might not get lucky, and your code might have some different behavior that's not really that you cannot expect. Sometimes you can just enter a large password and then it will give you access, because at the end it's unpredictable. So for such things, you need to be careful about like what you are giving as input to your program. For this, it will lead us to another point, and it's the final point here. It's input sanitization. In the beginning, in buffer overflows, we talk about the size, but in web applications, for instance, you need always to use escaping for XSS. And the golden rule here is never trust the user input. So you need to implement escaping to avoid like characters that can be executed as JavaScript. Of course, to avoid any XSS vulnerability, you need to implement escaping. For this escaping to the level of the escaping you are using, sometimes there are always bypasses, but at least you need to implement a decent security for your website. So any user input shall be checked before using it in your internal logic. Another thing, like with SQL injections, you need to escape some special characters like the quote, because it can trigger, especially if you are using in your backend directly the input as a SQL query. It's very dangerous because you don't know what the user will input, and sometimes you will return some unexpected results, and you will query actually your database, and it will lead to information leakage. Another thing is whenever you deal with an URL as input, you need to be very careful because they are quite weird. They might cause like server-side request forgery or other things that might be very dangerous. I wrote one article I'm not promoting my blog here, but it's just a useful article that you might check. And it talks about the format of the URLs. If you see the foo here is the protocol, user pass is the authentication. I'm sorry. Example.com is the domain. 1842 is the port. Over there is the path. The name is a parameter. AQ also is a parameter, and noise it's just like what do we call it? It's like placeholder or something like that. So for all of this, like this is IURL, this is the format. And if you are not really aware about how this format works, you might be like in some problems. So for the takeaways from this presentation is the first thing that we need to do is that we should not store secrets in the code. We need to make sure that any input is sanitized before usage. We need to plan ahead of time about the allocated memory for any like input that we want, and in some language this is handled automatically, and some safer language like Go, Rust, etc. We need also to be careful with any code that like you put online and also that you use online. You need like to always use trusted libraries. Never use some libraries that you don't know because they might have some vulnerabilities that you don't know about. Some points that I didn't talk about, but they are important, like you should not allow your application to execute arbitrary code, which means that you should never implement some functionality that executes code like in your machine, like to get just I don't know, to get the size of a file or whatever, and you use, for instance, bash to get it. Don't do that. The other thing also that's like used that causes a lot of problems is passphrases for tokens. Okay, they are called passphrases. They are called secret keys for the token generation, like in GWT or something. You need to use strong ones, and also you need to store them in a safe place, because if you have a weak passphrase, you have weak token, and anyone can break your authentication, and you wouldn't like to do that. So these are like briefly different things that you might want to discover and might want to deepen your knowledge in. As I said, this is a presentation as an introduction to these things. Of course, like any of the points that I talked about, like need a proper presentation on their own, to check like problems at a low level, analyzing them at a low level. But as an introduction of 30 minutes, etc., this is a good starting point for you, and thank you.
ثانك يو على البريزونطاسيون، فريمون كانت مزيانه. جو بونس الدراري كاملين يكونوا استافدوا. كاين عندنا دي كيسيون هنا. الوغ الكيسيون الاولى هو قال لك وات اباوت كروس سايت ريكويست forgery attack in web applications.
Okay, it's at the end it's the same thing. Okay, when the rule here that you need to consider, for any input that you have, you need to sanitize it. Okay, any input that you have, you need to sanitize it. If we are talking about CSRF, it's just like as XSS as any web, like a client-side vulnerability. You need to care about the sanitization of your input. You should not allow your application to execute something given by the user as it is. Okay, this is the thing that we need to enforce.
So I think الكيسيون الثانية كاينة عند زكريا الزيني. Why we have to deploy our codes on public platforms if it might be dangerous in case we don't secure our app well?
Yeah, that's a good point, but okay. Sometimes you want to build your portfolio. Sometimes you are working on at like a company that deploys code in Git, for instance, like that. One thing that you need to know, the first thing, if you are building a portfolio and for instance, I am a recruiter, I will check your code. If you do these practices, I know that like you don't know about these things. I know like for your level, I would assess your level just from your code. So this is one of the good things. If you are following good practices in like in deployment, in implementation, anyone who checks your code will know your level and will of course be encouraged to talk to you, to hire you, etc. This is one side. In the other side is that it's not only about open or public. It's not only about public. If you are working at a company, you are implementing a code and you are deploying your secret even in your company's like infrastructure as like how we can call it as plain text, it's a bad practice because you don't know who will see that code. For you are responsible of your commit, yes, but you don't know who will get to see that code. Maybe someone from your company and still it's malicious and he shouldn't or she shouldn't have access to that part, to that information. Okay, so it's your responsibility to secure it. So that's why you need always to use the best practices.
So ماشي ديفرنس واش بابليك ولا لا، دونك ديما خصنا نخليو اور كود زعما ما نخليوش فيه انفورميشنز اللي يقدروا
exactly هذا مشكل، كيكون مشكل فهمتي، مشكل بزاف، حيت مثلا ديال اوثنتيكيشن، مثلا الباس فريز ديال اوثنتيكيشن اتسيتيرا، الا شي واحد عرف ديك الباس فريز، اي توكن تما ممكن فهمتي نجيري توكن ديالي ونلوغي لا اي كونت، فهمتي، باش عرفتي شي واحد خدام معاك ما بغاش يهاكي الديريكتور ديالك، باش عرفتي.
دونك انت ديما خصك تخلي ديك دونك ديما خصك تبقى انت واخد الاحتياطات ديالك وصافي، ما تعرفش الكود ديالك شكون غادي. ندوزو للكيسيون الاخرى. انا ابغى الكاباج هي parameterized queries are usually used to avoid SQL injection. هذه عطيتو قلتها اسماء question. قالك why we should use CAPTCHA verification for forms before submitting.
Yeah, okay. That's also a good point. That's also a good point that I didn't talk about. CAPTCHA in mobile apps or in websites, etc. It's a mechanism for bot detection, for spam detection. I know for mobile it's not intuitive, but it's okay. It's a good way. It's a good way to, for instance, to protect your website from, or your application from bots, and to prevent it from sometimes from denial of service, because sometimes like someone would use your would crawl your website a lot of times, etc. It generates a lot of traffic for you, and it can cause, like as I said, denial of service. It can cause like information leakage sometimes, because sometimes in your policy you need, for instance, 500 requests per day per user, and then someone uses a bot and crawls the information that's out there, and it's not what you want to do. That's why, like, and also, okay, another thing is, for instance, in registration, you would want to use a CAPTCHA, because if I implement one bot that registers users, I can, for instance, create millions of accounts in your website, generate millions of fake emails. I guess you know also this, but there are websites that provide fake emails. I don't need to create an email to log into a website. So this is one of the things why, like, why we need the captcha. I need to check one thing here if I can share it with you. Let me see. Let me see. I don't know if it's. There was. Wait, let me look it. I'm looking for one thing. There was an attack on captcha. Like there was an actual account to bypass it, and it was with in captcha. For us, we always use the image as the simple thing. Okay, but there was another one that implemented an email-based bot that analyzes the sound and bypasses the captcha. Like it hears the sound and it analyzes it and it checks. It maps it, of course, with the sound recognition or speech recognition, and then create the captcha, and it was bypassed. But in the other versions of captcha now, it's like it's implemented. I'm just looking if there is a link that I can share with you. It's a very interesting one. Okay, let me see. Not this one. Wait. Yeah, yes, it's this one. Yeah, I can share it with you here. You can check it. It's a good thing to check. Let me see. I guess you can check that one. Okay, we can move to the other question.
So,
hi, Mehdi.
Other question?
Yes, sure. Not already done. I'm still here.
Generally what the purpose of captcha? I think راك شرحتيها دابا.
Yes.
دونك شنو الفرق بين salt and peppers؟
The paper, I think, not paper. Salt and peppers راه الملحة والبزار. The difference between them, one is black and one is white. Okay, let's. I know joke حامضة ولكن anyway. Salt, of course. Salt كيكون appended الباسورد. اي حاجه عشيتيها مثلا كتزيد بها السالت. بيبر لا. بيبر it can be stored independently على داك الباسورد. ما كيمشيش معاه. And it can be فهمتي checked independently from it. This is the main difference. It's just one of them is appended, one of them is not appended to it. It's a different thing. I think, yeah. If you have them, if you need more explanation, I can.
Mustafa, if you need more explanation,
just ask. Yeah, just ask.
So, Anas Bushfar question: can you explain asymmetric encryption? public key private key
Yes.
كيف انت رجع if you want please.
اوكي 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 ان دارجه. اوكي ليتس اكسبلين ان دارجه. شنو هي هاد البرايفت كي بابليك كي؟ هي عندك اسيدي واحد كتهز ورقه، فهمتي، ورقه كطوي على جوج، كتقطعها، كتكتب واحد النمبر، مثلا ا، واحد النمبر بي. داك النمبر بي فهمتي ممكن نخرجوا منه ا، ولكن ا ما عمر ممكن نخرجوا منه بي، فهمتي. وان واي فانكشن كيمشي غير لهاد، فهمتي، جهه وحده من بي ل ا، ولكن من ا ل بي ما يمكنش. كتسمى لوغاريتم، ديسكريت لوغاريتم بروبلم. اوكي، كيف فاش كتستعمل مثلا داك الا كتستعمل بحال السميه ايدنتيتي، انا سميتي احمد، فهمتي، مهدي، حسام، ايتترا، هادو بابليك. هاد البابليك ممكن تعطيها لاي واحد، واي واحد كيعرفها عليك، ماشي مشكل، اي واحد غيعرفها عليك. ديك البي غير بوحدك اللي كتعرفها، فهمتي، غير بوحدك اللي كتعرف. وديك بي كيما قلت لك كتخرج منها ديك ا، ممكن تخرج منها من ديك ا، ولكن ا ما ممكنش تخرج منها بي. كتستعمل بجوج الحوايج. واحد اللعيبه كتستعمل فيها هي سيغنيتشر، بحال كتسيني مثلا، كتهز شي، مثلا بغيت نصيفط لمهدي شي حاجه مثلا، وبغى يعرف واش اوثنتيك، واش انا اللي سينيتها ولا ماشي انا اللي سينيتها. اشنو ممكن ندير؟ غنهز انا ديك الورقه، وغنحط عليها غنسينيها ببي. غنسينيها ببي ماشي كي يعني غنحط فيها بي، غادي غير نسينيها ببي، زعما بحال كتستعمل ستيلو، بحال شي ستيلو يونيك، فهمتي، ديالك ستيلو يونيك، غنسيني في ديك الورقه. وداك ستيلو لونكر ديالو ممكن يتفيريفيا با. دونك مهدي غنصيفط ليه هاد الورقه، غيشوف داك لونكر ديال داك ستيلو، غيقارنو مع ديك ا اللي عنده هو، غيلقى بانه راه هاد ا راه ديال هاد ستيلو، فهمتي، ديال هاد الورقه. هذه الحاجه الاولى ديال السيغنيتشر. الحاجه الثانيه كتستعمل فور انكريبشن، فهمتي. كاين السيغنيتشر وكاين الانكريبشن. الانكريبشن شنو هي؟ مثلا انا بغيت نعطي شي انفورماسيون مثلا فهمتي، مثلا اوكي، اكسشينج ديال الانفورميشن بيني ومهدي مثلا، بغيت نصيفط ليه واحد البوكس ولا شي حاجه، وداك البوكس شي كارطونه ولا شي حاجه كان انكريبتيها بديك ا، ولا هو كي انكريبتيها با، هو مثلا غيصيفط ليا بوكس، هو انكريبتيها با هي ديالي، هي البابليك كي ديالي، كي انكريبتيه بديك البابليك. اوكي، وكيصيفط ليا، ملي كيصيفط ليا داك البوكس، انا حتى واحد ما يمكن يديكريبتيه، حيت ما يمكن، فهمتي، غيديكريبتي اونلي بالبرايفت كي ديالي، فهمتي. ملي انكريبتي بالبرايفت كي ديالي، انا ممكن ديكريبتي ونشوفه، ولكن اي واحد اخر ما يمكنش يشوفه، حيت كما قلنا وان واي فانكشن. اي هوب زعما اكسبلين، ما عمرني شرحتها بالعربيه، بس اي هوب اتس جود.
المهم على حسب ما كيبان زعما البابليك كي هي اللي باش تانكريبت ياك، والبرايفت باش ديكريبتي باش
اوكي، وان ثينك هنا اللي خصكم تفهموا، من البرايفت ممكن نمشيو للبابليك، ولكن من البابليك ما عمرنا ممكن نمشيو للبرايفت. اول حاجه، من البرايفت ممكن نمشيو للبابليك، ممكن نجينيريتيو بابليك، ولكن البابليك ما عمر ممكن نجينيريتيو البرايفت. اوكي، فيرست ثينك. سكند ثينك، بابليك من السميه ديالها ممكن تعطى لاي واحد، بحال دابا بلوك تشين مثلا كونت ديالك ولا الاكونت ديالك في ايثيريوم، راه كتكون عندك البابليك كي ديالك شنو هي، راه كتكون بابليك كي، وديك الادريس ديال ايثيريوم راه مجينيريتيا من ديك البابليك كي، داكشي علاش حتى هي راه بابليك، فهمتي. والبرايفت كي ديالك هي الاونلي واي تو اكسس يور اكونت، باش كيعرف، فهمتي، كيعرفك البلوك تشين عندها، فهمتي، كيعرفك راه عندها نفس الحاجه. عندنا الفيرست ثينك بابليك كي ستيز بابليك. Second thing, from a private key, we can generate a public key, but from a public key, we cannot generate a private key. الحاجة الثالثة we can use signatures فهمتي باش you can use it for signature باش نعطيو authenticity لواحد الانفورميشن زعما راه انا اللي درتها ماشي شي واحد اخر. and of course for encryption راه it's used to decrypt decrypt things.
So
بحال دابا especially في information exchange information exchange مثلا كان فهمتي مثلا انت غادي تانكريبتي بالبابليك كي ديالي انكريبتي بالبابليك كي ديالي وانا غنديكريبتيها بالبرايفت كي ديالي ولكن حتى واحد اخر ما يمكن يديكريبتي بالبابليك فهمتي. that's the point.
okay. So question عند محمد بن موجود. How can machine learning help cyber security?
Okay. This is a field of research, of course, and one of the examples that we talked about is bots, speech recognition used to bypass CAPTCHA. This is using machine learning in cybersecurity. There are other things that are like especially in malware analysis, for instance, detecting patterns in malware, how they like their behavior. Detecting pattern can be used in machine learning can be used for that. It's used like in a lot of things now. Network analyzing network traffic, detecting just from the behavior of like from network traffic, you analyze it to see if there are bots exploiting it, etc. Yeah, it's what else. There is another way, security of machine learning. Another thing, not only using machine learning for security, for instance, poisoning attacks for models. Like when you try to fool a model by injecting some backdoors or some like reversed pixels or some label flipping for in classification problems, etc. These all also, but this is the security of machine learning. They are interchangeable. There are things like a few examples that I mentioned that can use both of them.
I think it was واضحة. So Yassine Hadri, can you suggest for us any resources where we depend on to apply the best practices in apps security?
Yeah, for me, like there are some YouTube channels that are really good. One of them is Live Overflow. Live Overflow is a very good channel that you might want to check. The other resources, what I prefer is that I prefer to read the proof of concepts directly. For this, you can use HackerOne, and there are a lot of public proof of concepts that you can see, and you see vulnerabilities in big companies like Live. You see how they fix them, you see the mistakes that they do, and this is really, really good for the like knowing things to avoid. For the best practices, again, and I guess Mehdi will also agree with me in this thing, you can check, like for each language, there are like specific best practices that you need to use. You need to look for those specific best practices for each application, for each language that you are using. Another thing is check OWASP top 10. For OWASP top 10, it offers also like explanation of such services or such vulnerabilities, and also their mitigation, etc. And you will find a lot of resources that they also have. Of course, best practices is to avoid this WASP top 10.
So the other you can put the resources short. So yes, we have another question. If we have an e-commerce app and we are given free trials, how can we avoid the fake Visa cards that are auto-generated?
How to avoid them? Okay. If you don't have any contact with a payment gateway, just like avoiding from the structure, of course, Visa cards or MasterCards, they have specific structure. Okay, specific numbers, etc., generated in a specific way. There are things, of course, you can check it from this. There are libraries that check it, like depending on the number specifically, but someone will auto-generate something that satisfies the requirements. For this, you cannot know the fake ones until you try, like you connect to a payment gateway. But just if someone is inputting just arbitrary numbers, of course, it's easy to detect it. If you are talking about stolen cards, that's another point. Stolen cards, of course, you cannot know it until the bank tell you, hey, this is a stolen card. But for you don't have any view about it.
Other question. Anas Bashar, I watched your talk with Amir. You say machine learning can detect viruses with its binary code. Can you tell us
Yeah,
something about that?
yeah, sure. Okay, so you know that if we take, for instance, a botnet, a bot specifically, or we take some ransomware or something, we do static analysis for it. We extract its features like statically, or we can also run it in a sandbox and extract the features dynamically. Then we can build machine learning models that learn from these behaviors. Okay, they learn these behaviors and they classify them. And then if you give it a new ransomware, like of course, that might use some of the behaviors that were already learned by the model, it can detect it. So this is how it works. You extract features, static or dynamic. For binaries, if you just take binaries, you can like just analyze the code and see some code pattern, like code patterns, etc. But or dynamic, for dynamic, it gives you more room like for detection, because of course you observe the behavior. And for this, you can build machine learning models on top of this.
By the way, it was السوجي ديال التيب ديالي detects virus detection based on data mining. So
Yeah.
yes, I know. So why adding salt to passwords?
Why add insult to password? Just to avoid brute forcing. Like you add it to increase the security, like to avoid brute forcing. If you use an insecure encryption function, hashing function, or something like that, you use the salt to avoid dictionary attacks, to avoid brute force attacks. Another
So
point that, yeah, I saw it and it's related to that question. Then we move to the other questions. Yeah, Mustafa, I think he said, I know that the salt is just a random string added to password before hashing, but paper. For the paper, okay. For salt, it's random first. Yes, it's correct. And it is public. It is known. You can know the salt. Okay, it's not something secret because you see it. For the paper, it's not. For the paper, as I said before, it's stored independently from this hash. Plus, it is secret. Okay, it's a secret. You can think of it as an encryption key. It's a secret. It's a secret key. Like it's not like salt. It's public. So this is another. I mentioned it in the beginning, but maybe it's not. Wasn't really obvious. But for this, salt is public. Paper is private. Deal with paper as an encryption key or private key, and deal with salt as you deal with public keys. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
What's the, yes?
Yeah. Okay, you can read the question. I just saw it.
What's the best of mobile? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. For repeating. For me, for mobile SF, I don't really suggest any tutorials. I suggest to read the documentation and play with it. That's that's the way to learn it. I didn't really see a tutorial before. Their documentation is quite good, and like you can play with it like that, and it should be good. For dynamic analysis for Android applications, you can do something that's not really related to mobile SF. You can do, for instance, just a emulator like in Android Studio or Genymotion or whatever. You install a proxy with Burp Suite and you see how an app interacts, what it sends and what information it sends and how it interacts. That's also a dynamic analysis. For advanced dynamic analysis, you will need a rooted phone, okay, in order to see like the interactions at a low level. That's, I don't think, up to my knowledge, mobile SF supports that.
So, another question from Mehdi. Does public key encryption detect data corruption, or that should be added on top?
No, that's also a very good point. It detects data corruption, and it's, by the way, used also as checksum. The checksums, it's the same thing. When you like sign some file with some private key, if the file is different, and for instance you have the signature and you have the file, if just one bit is changed from the original file, if you run this signature on this file, it won't match. Single bit, it won't match. So yes, it detects data corruption.
So, question for Hamza and Mohammed. Is there an authentication system in banks that works with Shamir's secret
Yeah,
sharing?
secret sharing.
Yes. If not, what are the protocols used for this purpose?
Hamza, if you have some like Bitcoin wallet or Ethereum wallet with a lot of money and you want to share it with me, we can divide this private key to shares, and so we'll have some money. Okay, so just to explain to people who don't know Shamir's secret sharing. Okay, you take a private key. We are, for instance, 3 people or 5 people, and Hamza is rich, and he wants to give us also a part of the management of the governance. He can split the private key into shares, okay, into specific shares. For instance, five shares, and give us, each one of us, of 5 of us, he gives us a small point, a small share from this private key. For this, there are 2 ways. There are either you set the shares to be full, so everyone should be present and give their share in order to decrypt, or there is another point where you select, for instance, 3/5. Just if any 3 of people are agree, you can actually decrypt whatever is there. So this is the first thing. If it's related to banks or not, yeah, maybe, because you can think of any situation where there is a shared governance, where there is no central point that controls. You can use Shamir secret sharing, because you can actually, each one will have a portion of it, and any decision will not be taken until the 3, depending on the rule, the 3 of them are there, or at least 2, or for instance, 3/5, or 4/5, or 2/5, or 5/5, depending on what you want to achieve.
So, كيبان ليا ما بقاش حتى question. اللي مازال ما عندوش question يقدر يحطها في الشات.
يا نرجع لواحد الكويشن كانت في الاول على اي ثينك اي ديدنت ريلي emphasize on it على السي ار كروس client side request forgery. The attack in itself is related on social engineering. Okay, it's of course like you want to protect your users, and to protect your users you need always again to like to sanitize your input. The other thing here is the difference between like XSS, for instance, and CSRF is for XSS it does not need any human interaction. It does not need, for instance, social engineering act to be used. It can be exploited directly on your directly on your website. For CRF, it's different because you need always some like some interaction from the user. And what else? Yeah, I think that should be it.
So thank you very much. استفدنا بزاف فريمون داكشي كان مزيان. I think
مرحبا.
خرجنا بزاف د الحوايج زايدين من هذا التالك. So شكرا بزاف.
مرحبا. The next one مهدي جاي. I think.
I think. Let's نشوف. Yeah.
لا التراك ديال مهدي كان الصباح.
Nice.
ما قاليش.
So
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
مرحبا. Thank you so much.